Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, Iran and Israel have exchanged missile fire for the first time since April in direct contravention of US President Donald Trump's orders, apparently. We speak to Richard Sanders from Double Down News about the establishment media's blind spot on Palestine action and many other places. JD Vance has waded into the debate around Henry Nowak's death, and following his ban from the UK, Hasan Piker goes head-to-head with Lewis Goodall on LBC. I'm Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by our one true queen, Ash Sarkar. Ash, how are you? You've been away for a little bit. You weren't on last week, I don't think.
I wasn't. So I was being deployed to another bit of the organisation because apparently the pipes were blocked and no one else could sort it out.
And we all know you're really good with a spanner and a hammer or whatever you use to do pipes. I reckon those are the right things. Before we start the show tonight, we just wanted to share that we're now 70% towards reaching our stretch goal of 5,000 new regular supporters. So a huge thank you from me, a huge thank you from Ash to everyone who's decided to back our work in the past few weeks. Without your support, Novara just wouldn't exist at all. Imagine that. Getting 5,000 new regular supporters will help us to expand our reporting and reach even more people ahead of the next general election. You might not think that giving £1 a month will make a difference, but having lots of small, regular donations makes us resilient and keeps us completely free to access. So if you've been thinking about signing up for a while now, now's the time. Head to novara.media/support to back us today. Ash, why don't you tell the audience why you think they should back us? None of the reasons I already gave, please.
Well, the cocaine and puppies budget is getting out of hand. Shh. No, not really. No, not really. The truth is that when it comes to small, regular donations, that allows us a degree of editorial freedom that you're just not going to get anywhere else. We don't have to appease a billionaire owner. We don't have to speak in a language that liberal philanthropic funders really like. We don't have to think about how we do the most clickbaity stuff possible so we can offer a return to venture capital. All those things mean that we're able to present our journalism in a way which we think is going to have the most integrity and have the most impact. And I used a really important word here, which is I see what we do as journalism and not content. And that's expensive. So me and Stephen worked really closely together around the coverage of Palestine action. And I don't know if you remember that summer and how much time we spent poring over legal advice and trying to make sure that we had every bit covered as much as possible so that we could do things that other people in the media just weren't doing at that time. So we were repeating the slogans of Defend Our Jury's protesters. We were showing the placards that said, I support Palestine action. And we did all that actually without a guarantee of legal safety. A lot of the time, the lawyers didn't know what was going to be safe or unsafe either. But we did it with, I think, as strong a basis as we could possibly get. And I want to do all of that again, and I want to do all of that more. And by more, what I mean is, I think that there are all sorts of areas that we are just not quite able to cover just yet. I really want us to do more investigations. I want us to be able to take I guess, bigger swings against the government. So do stories where it really matters, that we've dotted every I and we've crossed every T. And I would also, and this is going to sound weird, I want us to be able to fail sometimes. And what I mean by that is that we do these audience surveys. Our audience always says we want more stories about climate change. And then, because I can see the back end, we do the climate change story and it's not getting traction. So I would love to be able to fund, whether it's one full-time journalist or maybe two, to basically go, your job for 12 or 24 months is to do climate journalism that people read. And that means that they have to afford to be able to make mistakes, which is just not quite in our budget yet.
Yeah, making mistakes is so important, right? Because that's also how you learn, and that's how you hone things and improve things by doing things that aren't quite so successful, but finding the thing that really works and then building on that. And I've got to say, on the investigations, I completely agree. I often think that we are so close. I mean, I always think we punch really above our weight already, but we're so close to really breaking through into affecting the sort of news schedule or the chosen stories of the mainstream press in various ways. And it would just take one or two really solid investigations that we could, have people pour their time and energy into uncovering something that really needs to be uncovered and it also needs to be picked up. That will be the way that we break through. So yeah, investigations I think are vital
I
for us.
want people to feel about Novara the way they feel when they get a phone call from Isaac Chotiner, which is it's Novara Media on the phone and they shit themselves. That's what I want.
Okay, that's what I like. I like a good solid goal. That's really helpful. You know, we had one before, which was we want to get some scalps. That I can understand. Very simple. Let's go for it. Make people shit themselves and ring them up. Great. For the first time since a shaky ceasefire took hold in April, Israel and Iran have attacked each other's territory. The exchange of missiles began on Sunday. That's when Israeli missiles struck buildings in the southern suburbs of Lebanon's capital, Beirut. According to Israel, the target was a Hezbollah headquarters. 2 people were killed and at least 20 were injured, including children, according to the Lebanese government. That strike on Beirut came just days after a US brokered truce between the Lebanese government and Israel was agreed, though Hezbollah was not part of that deal. And it followed an earlier Israeli strike on southern Lebanon on Saturday that killed 3 Lebanese soldiers, including a brigadier general. So not Hezbollah members, but soldiers from the army that Israel just signed a peace deal with. And the bombing of southern Beirut was also, it appears, in direct contravention of US President Donald Trump's orders. That's after Trump reportedly shouted and swore at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last week over an earlier threat from the country to bomb Beirut. According to those reports, Trump called Netanyahu fucking crazy, telling him, everybody hates you now. And it eventually led to the breakdown of difficult ceasefire negotiations between the US and Iran, with Iran demanding the full withdrawal of Israel from Lebanon. In response to Sunday's strikes on Beirut, Iran took matters into its own hands. That was footage released by Iran and said to show the country launching a barrage of ballistic missiles towards Israel. Late on Sunday night, those Iranian missiles were spotted over northern Israel, including in cities like Haifa. According to the Israeli military, there were no casualties or damage. Israel returned fire, with explosions reported in Tehran and Isfahan, while a petrochemical complex was hit in the country's west. That led to further strikes from Iran, with explosions heard in Jerusalem as well as in the occupied West Bank, where this missile remnant also fell. Now, just after Iran had fired its first volley of missiles at Israel, Trump gave a phone interview to Fox News. According to reports, he said he'd instructed Netanyahu not to retaliate against Iran. That instruction appears to have been ignored. Around the same time, Trump also gave an interview to the Financial Times. In it, Trump said the Israeli Prime Minister would have no choice but to accept a deal with Iran. And this is a Trump quote from that article. He won't have any choice. I call the shots. I call all the shots. He, Netanyahu, that he means, doesn't call the shots. This morning, Trump tried again, posting this on Truth Social. Israel and Iran must immediately stop shooting. President Donald J. Trump. A few hours later, both sides appeared to agree. By lunchtime, both Iran and Israel had halted their fire, though each side had left it open that the attacks could resume. Ash, having a pop at each other again, do you think this is the beginning of something bigger, or does it look fairly contained to you?
Well, I actually think that Iran's strike on Israel shows what their military calculation actually is. So this is person reporting in the New York Times, a quote from Sadegh Larijani, the chairman of Iran's Expediency Council, said that basically it's about responding to attacks on the axis of resistance that Iran says, no, you've gone too far. So obviously there hasn't been a ceasefire in any meaningful sense when it comes to Israel's operations in Gaza or in Lebanon. And when it's come to Israel's military actions in Lebanon, when they've been conducting airstrikes in southern Lebanon, Iran has raised objections but hasn't really done anything to retaliate. What changed is that yesterday there were airstrikes that hit the south of Beirut. Now, what that means in terms of Hezbollah is that, yes, there is a strong Hezbollah presence in the south of Lebanon, but politically they're strongest in Beirut. So I think this is Iran's military calculation, which is we're not going to be able to defend the axis of resistance everywhere they are. But it's important that they're still in play. It's important that they're not completely and utterly destroyed. So the line is going to be don't touch Beirut. So I think that explains the exchange of fire today. The other part, and this is the part that we're probably going to focus on a bit more, is the sort of uneasy tail wagging the dog relationship between Israel and America. Now, these are quotes that I love to wheel out. One is one from Netanyahu in the early 2000s, where he said, "I know what America is. It is a thing that moves." Something which is really key to understanding Netanyahu's role in Israeli politics is his ability to take the lead, change so-called facts on the ground that compels America to move in a particular way. Quite famously, Bill Clinton, talking about Israel, said, who's the fucking superpower here? There is this feeling that where Israel goes, America is compelled to follow. Now, I think that can simplify things. There's an extremely dependent relationship between Israel and America, particularly for arms, particularly for the kind of funding which goes into the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome, I think, is a mistake to think of it as a purely defensive capacity. It is something which insulates Israel from the consequences of its own foreign policy decisions. So it enables Israeli aggression. But that is, I think, the central dynamic, between Israel and the United States from the early 2000s till now. It is this thing of going, how do I make America move?
And why is America so movable? Why does it work? I guess is a question, a follow-on question from that.
I mean, it's a combination of things. So the first thing is that Israel is really central to American foreign policy. So Israel's always been understood as a sort of Western settler colonial outpost, going way back to the Balfour Declaration and the image of Israel as being a little Ulster. So it's sort of an outpost amongst, enemy peoples. And that really matters when you think about the movement of weapons, the movement of troops, so on and so forth. Second thing is, of course, the disciplining role of AIPAC and Israeli lobbyists in American politics. Now, often this is understood as AIPAC will fund candidates. So candidates are in the pocket of AIPAC. And there's truth in that, but that's not the entire truth. It has a really effective role in disciplining politics because AIPAC will fund and pour huge amounts of money into running rival candidates in primaries. And that's, I think, where they're most effective. So it's not just about, I've given you, Congressman Methven, this much money. It's, if you don't toe the line, I'm going to give congressional candidate Sarkar a fuck ton of money to try and unseat you. Then you've got other elements, which is you have a media disposition, which is, broadly the landscape of acceptable opinion is liberal Zionist to, quite frankly, genocidal. You've got the particular political role of the evangelical Christians and the way in which they frame Israel. I don't think you can boil down to why is it America so movable just to one thing. You have to look at all these things together.
I have a question about about Netanyahu and the election. So there was, I don't know if you remember that report coming out last week that Trump had this angry phone call and sworn at him on the phone and whatever, and that again was over threatening to bomb Beirut in the middle of the very delicate ceasefire negotiations between the US and Iran. And a lot of people came out and said, this is just rubbish. This is like the kind of thing we've seen before. Apparently Biden did it as well. And, this sort of posturing. Actually, the FT reports that in their interview with Trump, he didn't deny that he'd had that phone call with Netanyahu in those terms. But I wonder if there's something important domestically for Netanyahu in this case. So Trump says that he told Netanyahu to stop. Netanyahu didn't, and he bombed back. Netanyahu's facing an election really soon. He's really at risk at the moment. The coalition of the kind of opposition Zionist parties are, 2 or 3 seats over him. And there's even a suggestion that the only way that his kind of coalition can survive is if he relies on Arab parties, which, not going to be great for him. So it could be that there's this something politically expedient here for him in being seen to snub Donald Trump for his domestic audience.
I mean, look, endless war benefits Netanyahu. And so we've talked about things sort of structurally in terms of what are Israel's interests. And we're thinking about Israeli interests in terms of wanting to become the regional hegemon. And we've, of course, thought about it in terms of the project of ethnic cleansing and genocide when it comes to the people of Palestine. But there is something which is, again, kind of unique here, which is Netanyahu is facing corruption charges, being dragged in and out of the courts. And he's Israel's great political survivor, right? He always manages to hang on by his fingernails and make a screaming comeback because I think he's a epoch-defining politician for the state of Israel. And the thing which benefits him and keeps the Israeli public on side is that anybody who thought post-October 7th that he would be held accountable for the security breaches that resulted in Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, that was kind of for the birds, because he goes, well, what I do is I just create a new set of circumstances, a new set of imperatives that come from taking military action, and that is a form of political protection for me. And I think that there is a similar calculation being made here. The interesting thing is that for Trump in a midterm year, is that already the US and Israeli joint war on Iran in such a short amount of time has become as unpopular nationally as the Vietnam War. And that took years for Vietnam to become that unpopular. Yeah. So there's also electoral pressure there.
Also rising gas prices for Trump as well, which are never a good thing, not in America anyway. Last week, 4 Palestine Action activists made an application for the judge in their case to recuse himself. Mr. Justice Johnson had presided over both the original trial of the Filton Six in February, as well as their retrial last month. Today, at a hearing at the Old Bailey, Justice Johnson heard the application from Leona Eli Cameo, Charlotte Lottie Head, Fatima Zainab Rajwani, and Samuel Corner, who had raised questions of bias in the judge's conduct. All 4 were convicted of criminal damage last month, with Samuel Corner also convicted of grievous bodily harm, though without intent, which had been the original charge. In that same trial, fellow defendants Zoe Rogers and Jordan Devlin were acquitted. We can now report that the 4 activists have not been successful in their attempt to have the judge recuse himself, with Mr. Justice Johnson saying this in court. Any fair-minded observer would not consider a real possibility of bias. I therefore refuse to recuse myself. A spokesperson for Defend Our Juries said this. The only safeguard in place for a judge who ignores the jury's verdict is to rely on that judge removing themselves. It's not likely to surprise anyone that this is not what happened today. Mr. Justice Johnson will continue with the case of the Filton Four, who he will sentence on Friday. These 4 young people face being sentenced as terrorists, despite not being convicted of terror offences and not being found guilty of intentional violence. That's a reference to the terror connection found in this case by the judge at a pretrial hearing last year, one that was subjected to reporting restrictions until last month, meaning the jury were never told it existed. Now, the activists' effort to remove the judge was in part based on the fact that he had attempted to prosecute Rajiv Menon, the barrister of Charlotte Head, for contempt of court in the first trial. This is from our report at the time. Before the first of 2 trials involving Head, Mr. Justice Johnson ruled that the actions of the Israeli military in Gaza did not constitute a lawful excuse for her and her co-defendants. Johnson also banned barristers from inviting the jury to apply the principle of jury equity, by which juries can choose to acquit based on their conscience. However, Menon is alleged to have made reference in his closing speech to Bushell's case, a 1670 decision associated with establishing the independence of juries, and an Old Bailey plaque highlighting the right of juries to give their verdict according to their convictions. The effect of Mr. Menon's speech was to invite the jury to disregard my directions that they should put views of the Middle East and the war in Gaza and emotion to one side, Johnson said at the time. In that case, however, Johnson didn't get his way. Menon won an appeal against the attempt to prosecute him, with the Court of Appeal saying it was procedurally flawed. The judge could, of course, resume his prosecution if he wishes, but it would have to get the Attorney General's approval first. And today in court, Menon received an apology of sorts from the judge for the way the case had been handled. Now, I'm very delighted to say I'm joined now by fellow independent journalist and presenter of Double Down Newswatch, Richard Sanders. Richard, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So before we start, because we want to talk about independent media and the kind of the job of independent reporters, I wanted to ask you what you thought of this story and this and this news today that the judge won't recuse himself. I don't think anyone really expected him to. And so sentencing will go ahead on Friday of these 4 defendants, and that may involve this terror connection coming up.
All the indications all along have been that he will apply the terror connection, which is something the jury, as you've said, was not aware of at all during the trial. So they're tried and convicted for one thing and then sentenced for another, which self-evidently seems appallingly unfair. On Double Down Newswatch 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had the 2 Palestine Action activists who were acquitted.
Zoe Rogers and Jordan Devlin.
That's right, in the first trial. And it was interesting. We did a long interview, and we ran it at a fair bit of length as well. And really, in talking to them in depth, for the first time, it became absolutely clear to me the degree to which the Filton 24 trials and the prescription of Palestine action are bound up together. The whole purpose of the Filton 24 trials was to create a sort of framing by which the prescription of Palestine action made sense, which is why they keep having to bring in these terror charges and so on. Now, it seems to me we're left with a potentially appalling situation here where all the indications are Judge Johnson will go ahead and apply the terror connection next week. Or later this week, isn't it?
On Friday.
On Friday, yeah. Yeah. Now, this might mean extending their sentences. More importantly, it means they won't be able to apply for parole until 2/3 of the way through their sentence.
That's right.
And in order to get parole, they will have to sort of admit, they were guilty. They can't sort of continue to speak out for what they believe in. And then for the rest of their lives, they have the most appalling restrictions placed on them. So, it's very serious. This is an appalling thing to be doing to these young people. And then possibly a few days later, we will get the decision on the government's appeal over the prescription of Palestine action, which they will quite possibly lose, at which point Palestine action is no longer prescribed as a terrorist organization. But these 4 young people are in jail for a lengthy period of time as terrorists.
Well, of course, the terror connection was made before Palestine action was prescribed, and it's that sort of order of events that kind of makes it sort of look as though a case needed to be made for the prescription of the group, and so a terror connection had to be found or potentially be found on someone involved with it, which could then be used as a justification for the prescription. Of course, the prescription is what would define any members as terrorists, not the initial finding of a terror connection. So it's all sort of kind of topsy-turvy and interlaced in a very strange way.
It's all back to front, and as you say, yes, it was quite clearly designed to provide justification for the prescription. But I mean, the application of terrorist legislation here. I'm old enough that I can remember when they introduced all this terror legislation way back. And it's a big deal charging people as terrorists because basically you suspend habeas corpus, you suspend all sorts of rights. And people said at the time, well, okay, if it means stopping somebody blowing up Canary Wharf or something, okay. But how do we know you're not going to use it or somebody won't come to power who will use it for other reasons? They also, no, that could never happen. And that's precisely what we're seeing. We're seeing these appalling suspensions of people's basic civil rights when it's clearly not justified.
One of my great criticisms of the Labour government at this point, when we're potentially going to see a reform government down the road, is that this prescription sets the precedent by which governments can start to prescribe groups that it doesn't like, even though they don't, but in anybody's understanding of the word terrorism, look like they're doing anything like terrorism. And it seems to me deeply irresponsible to be, changing the meaning of the word just at this particular moment in time, especially. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, we had John McDonnell on the programme on Double Down Newswatch a couple of weeks ago, and he was making precisely this point. If and when Nigel Farage becomes Prime Minister, he won't really need any new laws. He's been handed all the tools by the present government.
No new laws, and also he's got the precedents. You use the ones that already exist, right? In a way that's never been used before.
Yeah, exactly.
I wanted to ask you about the interview that you did with Zoe Rogers and Jordan Devlin. I mean, that seems to me like exactly the kind of thing that independent media is really important for. I can't think of the BBC sitting down with those two and doing sort of long-form interviews with them. I've seen, shorter print interviews, but I don't know if I saw them on any of the mainstream broadcast media, but I might have missed them. But at any rate, the length and the detail in which you're able to go into is, that's an essential part of independent media, right? We're not constrained in the same way that Channel 4 is or the BBC is.
That's right. I mean, Zoe and Jordan had spoken to other media, but very briefly. No one had really gone into the story and unpacked it in the way we did, and really spelled out what an absolute travesty those trials were. I mean, the sort of triple whammy, and the core point being this business that they could not use lawful excuse as a defense. In other words, they weren't allowed to explain to the jury why they'd done it, which if I was on the jury, I would feel the whole trial was a complete travesty. Because, I mean, you meet Jordan and Zoe, the idea that they would just spontaneously raid an arms factory is patently absurd. So, the jury can make up its own mind. The jury can decide whether that is justifiable excuse or not. But to forbid them from even offering that defense, it seems to me, rendered the whole trial a farce. And then that's compounded by the fact that then, retrospectively, you can decide they're all terrorists and sentence them on that basis.
Yeah, one of the interesting reasoning behind the judge's finding of a terror connection early on was that he understood the activists trying to influence the policy of Israel by denying them, certain, by breaking their property essentially and trying to get them to change their policy. And when I interviewed Jordan Devlin on this show a few weeks ago, he was really clear that it had nothing to do with influencing Israeli policy. It really just had to do with breaking the things that could be used to kill people in Gaza, just destroying those weapons, those drones, which are by sight look to be the same quadcopters that are used to emit the cries of children to draw Palestinians out so they can get shot. What did you think about the judge's reasoning there that this was an attempt to somehow influence the policy of Israel?
It all feels very random and very bizarre. I mean, even the the terrorist connection, they've decided that serious damage to property amounts to a terrorist connection, which isn't most people's understanding of it. And they appear to have plucked a figure of $1 million out of thin air if you do more than $1 million. And nowhere has Elbit, the arms manufacturer, been asked to come up with any evidence. I mean, what happens on that night? Things go very wrong on that night. They hadn't expected security to be there immediately and to attack them.
Yeah.
They were attacked by the security people, and I don't think they had a chance to do a great deal of damage. So I'm really not sure where the million pound figure came from.
I may be wrong, but I believe that nothing has been put into evidence which lists all the things that were destroyed. I think that's a complaint that's been made several times. Right?
It's just been plucked out of thin air.
Yeah.
I mean, very, very little has been required of Elbit in these proceedings. It's extraordinary.
Now, of course, this is not the kind of conversation you're going to see anywhere else, right? Except on independent media like Novara Media, like Double Down News, sort of having an open conversation about the details of what I think of as one of the most politicized cases in recent British history, certainly in my memory. And I think this is, exactly why people should support Novara Media, should go and watch Double Down News, because
and support us as well.
Well, you go for it, because it's crucial in the media environment that we have that people are able to have these conversations and are able to talk through the details of what looks, in our opinions, to be some poor judgments here, to say the least, and in some ways also to be subversions of a law that we, actually all kind of hold up, or a justice system that we ought to hold up, right?
Yeah, yes, and I think that's become more and more true. I'm not sure it was as true 20 years ago that you wouldn't get these conversations on mainstream media. I made certainly over 50 films for British terrestrial TV. I go all the way back. I was in Kosovo in the summer of '99. I was in Iraq in the summer of 2003. I did the Afghan War as well. I never felt constrained. It's odd. I mean, it's really a phenomenon of the last 7 or 8 years where you just begin to feel this sort of disconnect when you're watching mainstream media or trying to work in mainstream media. And there does seem to have been a deterioration. And people will often point back to World in Actions in the 1980s. But even, Dispatches still does some good stuff now, but even that 10, 15 years ago, there does seem to have been a change. And I think, it's a bit like politically, the Greens have flowed into this enormous gap. The Labour Party's just vacated this enormous space to the left. Journalistically, we're almost sucked into a vacuum. I think there is an enormous appetite for independent media. When I talk to young people, they always, Novara is always the one they mention. Double Down News, the first thing I did for Double Down News, I'd made a film called October 7 for Al Jazeera's investigative unit, and I just came in to chat about that. I didn't really know Double Down News at that point. Got 3.5 million views, and there was clearly a massive appetite for, certainly for alternative perspectives.
Yeah. Before I let you go, Richard, you're now presenting Double Down News Watch, so tell us about that.
Yes, so the original idea there was it was going to be a sort of weekly news program that competed with Laura Kunsberg and Trevor Phillips. And it probably would go out on a Friday, and it was sort of 50 minutes long, perhaps 3 stories. We had these little inserts that my colleague Lorna Hosford did. Now, we're very pleased with the programs we've done. I'm not sure it's a terribly social media way of doing things. I'm not sure how much people consume things in 50-minute chunks. So we're simply essentially doing the same thing. What we were doing there was we'd put the program out, and then subsequently we'd put each of the stories out individually. We're just now doing it the other way around. We put the stories out individually as we do them. And we'll then perhaps put together an omnibus edition once a week. But the main thing to look out for in terms of Double Down News Watch is the individual stories we're putting. So we did an interview with Carol Cadwallader last week, which is the most recent thing we've done. We should have an interview with Peter Oborn. It was a fascinating story with Peter Oborn, Middle East Eye, a superb publication. And we very much see ourselves as a platform for elevating other publications. You know, we'd love to cover Novara stories. Extraordinary story they'd done about how the Americans are angling to remove the custodianship of the holy sites in Jerusalem from Jordan's Hashemite dynasty. Enormously important story. And Middle East Eye's sourcing is very good. If it reports it's no one seems remotely interested. Anyway, the next few days we'll have Peter Oborn up chatting about that.
Excellent. Richard, thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Last week, British headlines were dominated by the horrific killing of teenage Southampton student Henry Nowak last December. Following the sentencing of his murderer, Vikram Digwa, police body cam footage was released showing their inept, callous, and completely disgraceful treatment of the fatally injured young man. While Nowak lay dying at their feet, he was handcuffed and repeatedly pulled around, his cries of "I can't breathe" completely ignored by the officers. When he told one that he'd been stabbed, the reply was disgusting. "I don't think you have, mate." And to add enraging insult to fatal injury, his murderer stood by, claiming he'd been the victim of a racist attack and pointing to completely invisible bruises on his face. While the country was in a state of anger and despair, Reform UK leader Nigel Farage appeared to use his platform to call for violence, labelling the death of Nowak a case of, quote, anti-white racism, and telling his followers, quote, "We should respond to this with pure, cold rage." That's exactly what they appear to do, also goaded on by figures like Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, resulting in violent attacks on the police in Southampton last Tuesday, with bins, bottles, bricks, and blazing skips used as weapons. 11 police officers were injured, and so far 14 people have been arrested for the riots. Now, Farage has been roundly criticised for his comments, especially since Nowak's father had pleaded with politicians not to use his death to stoke anger or division. And polling from the Makerfield constituency appears to show it might not have done his party any favours, with Labour's Andy Burnham now pulling out even further ahead amongst voters there. But now, one of Farage's supporters in the US has decided to wade in too. US Vice President J.D. Vance posted this on Friday. Henry Nowak died the same way a civilization dies, abandoned, handcuffed by authorities who neither trusted nor cared for him, and accused of hate crimes he did not commit. His murder is as tragic as it is enraging. He should still be alive today, and he would be if the last few generations of European elites had stood their ground against the politics of self-hatred and the mass invasion of migrants, many of whom despise the West and the people who love it. On Sunday, Trevor Phillips asked Foreign Secretary David Lammy about those comments.
Vice President of the United States has shared his views about this. And it's well known he's your mate. What did you make of his comments?
Well, I spoke to the Vice President yesterday.
Oh.
And I wanted to emphasise a number of things. The first is that our democratic process is working well. This young man has been convicted. There is an investigation into the police by the Independent Police Complaints Authority. There is an investigation into Hampshire Police by the Inspectorate. The AG is looking at the sentencing in relation to this. The National Police Chiefs are looking at the guidance in relation to this. The second thing was I disagree with him. This has got nothing to do with mass migration. This young man was a Brit. Let's be clear about that. And I said, look, Mr. Vice President, you're wrong about this. And it's also the case that actually murder is coming down in the United Kingdom. So we had an agreeable conversation, but we disagreed.
But it sounds like you gave him a ticking off and told him to keep his nose out of our business.
We had an agreeable conversation because we have got a relationship. But I wanted to make him clear that I disagreed with some of the facts that he was asserting and to present the facts to him.
Ash, a pretty chummy interview there between Trevor Phillips and David Lammy. I wanted to ask you about J.D. Vance's intervention here, because it struck me as pretty mad, to be honest. As, you know, he knows very little about the country, knows obviously very little about the case and the perpetrator involved in it, and yet he's waded in just, you know, days after Nigel Farage has been roundly criticised for, you know, appearing to stoke violence and appearing to use this murder for political ends. Here you get JD Vance using it for his own political ends in a way that doesn't actually wouldn't just not make sense to anyone in this country.
Well, what it does is that it breathes a new lease of life into the story that the far right are telling. And I think that with the Southport killings and the conviction of Axel Rueda-Cabana, we are in a new era of how crime is being understood and the role of social media has in amplifying a particular story. Now crime is being seen through purely a racialized lens. And I think there were things that built up to that. It's obviously not the first time in British history that that's happening. But now, if you are in a situation where you have a perpetrator of colour, it doesn't matter if they're born in this country or not, it's being connected to immigration. Even if they were born here, even if they're as British as, you know, anyone in this room, even if they're as British as Nigel Farage, because it's now being seen through this racialized lens. Well, if you stopped immigration, this wouldn't have happened. Now, that's a bit like saying, you know, if only Jimmy Savile's mum had, you know, had an abortion, or if only, you know, someone had left A.B. Hitler, you know, on the hill today. It's an absurd argument, but I think that tells you something about the way in which the lines between anti-immigration sentiment and outright racism are becoming increasingly blurred. What's, I think, so startling about this case is that with Axel Rueda-Cabana, you had the initial misinformation. This is a small boats migrant. That idea of we're going to explain this by immigration, it doesn't change once it's revealed that he's born in Wales, because then it goes, well, his parents fled the Rwandan genocide. That must have something to do with it. When it comes to Vikram Digwa and the actions of his family as well, who assisted him in the concealment of his crime, Sikhs used to be something of a model minority for the far right. They would constantly be cited by the likes of Tommy Robinson of, well, see, we don't have a problem with, you know, Asian people in general, because look at the Sikhs, they just get on with it.
I think at one time he said we need more Sikhs and less of whoever else he was, you know, objecting to at that time. Yeah.
And it's taken one guy, it's taken one crime. And quite recently, there was a conviction in a case where it was a white British man who killed a Saudi Arabian student. And I've got no idea what the circumstances of the crime. I've got no idea if racism was a motivating factor or not. But the fact that that's not become a story in the same way tells you that race only does the heavy lifting, only does the political work in particular political moments. And I think that what this is really about is punishment for 2020 and Black Lives Matter. Yeah. That's really what it's about. Now, there are going to be some people that really disagree with me about this. I actually think taking a knee for Henry Nowak is completely appropriate. And the reason why is this, is because Colin Kaepernick was taking the knee in protest of racialized police violence in the United States, right? That was the issue. And it was a way of saying, you know, we're not really included in this national moment because of this police violence. Now, I don't think that Henry Nowak was a victim of racialized police violence, but he was a victim of police indifference. And it was that sort of indifference and that, like, I don't think you've really been stabbed, mate, all that kind of thing, that led to him dying in the kinds of circumstances that could only be completely horrific. So I think as a protest against the police, it's completely appropriate, but that's not why people are doing it. They're doing it because what they've, you know, there is this huge envy that the right have of left-wing movements. And that's why they always use the aesthetics and the language to do their sort of photo-negative version of it. They recognise the power of George Floyd. They wanted a George Floyd of their own, except their George Floyd, you know, Henry Nowak, is not being presented as a victim of police indifference. He's being presented as a victim of anti-racism having gone too far.
Yeah, I always think I was saying this to Aaron in the studio the other day, that there's something about the way that these things are kind of constructed on the right, which is kind of like the woke upside down, where it's like, you know, the Black Lives Matter happened because there was a lot of anger around legitimate grievance around the treatment of historically people of color by the police. There's somehow the digging up of some kind of grievance here, which isn't actually the grievance that people have, right? But it's somehow the focus of a kind of energy which mirrors the thing that you might think had an actual grievance at its heart. And the grievance here is one which is, for a lot of people, deeply economic. But that's not a question that Reform can answer, right? No. Because Reform is not actually the party of working class British people of any race, right? Reform is led by a millionaire who sells gold bullion online, right?
Well, I mean, I think there are huge incoherences within Reform. And I think that maybe, the left hasn't quite worked out how to find the vulnerability of Reform. Because when you talk about race and when you talk about immigration, they go, well, these are actually our selling points. Thank you very much. You've just amplified them. But there was this interview that was being done between Nigel Farage and Robert Kenyon, the Makerfield candidate, where Robert Kenyon was driving around Makerfield in a van. And at one point, they're saying, well, look, there's a problem for apprenticeships because now you've got to pay the minimum wage for apprenticeships. So, they're sort of dying out. And you can agree with that. You can disagree with that. That's the point they made. And then, not that long afterwards, they're talking about how everything's too expensive nowadays. Make that make sense. So either young people are being screwed over because they're not being paid enough, there's a cost of living crisis, they can't get ahead, or actually the problem is that minimum wage workers are getting paid too much and now that's applying to apprenticeships as well. Like these two things aren't coherent. And I think that they've been astonishingly successful in putting together a coalition where there are divergences in interest and there are divergences of economic interest. Will that be something that they can maintain all the way up into 2029? I actually think yes.
Oh, really?
I actually think yes.
I don't know. I think 2029 is going to be a huge election one way or the other, though, because it's going to be one of the most galvanizing elections that we've seen probably in our lives, actually, where people, I'm talking about even 1997, which was a big turnout, people will, I think, really, really turn out in that election in a way we haven't seen. And I think that turnout, the kind of level of protest that there might be at a Reform government is not coming through in the polls yet, because people aren't yet thinking about it in that way.
I think it's a tricky one, right? There will be a energetic anti-reform vote, but now we've got a reality of five-party politics sitting underneath a first-past-the-post system. You are not going to have many direct competitor seats between the Greens and Reform. You have a lot between Greens and Labour. If you're in London or in city centres around the country, you can pretty much safely give your vote to the Green Party. But there are going to be lots of Labour Reform competitor seats where people will be voting Green because it reflects their values better, economic policy, disappointment and frustration with Labour. So even if you have a very motivated Labour vote, which I think will be a challenge still, but let's say, you get a new leader in, blah, 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 blah. Let's say you don't have that effect of a depressed Labour vote, but you do have a Green vote. There is a reality there of that being something which leads to a Reform majority. There's no way to get around it.
Yeah. For sure. Reform UK's leader Nigel Farage may enjoy stoking up Trumpian division in the UK, but there are signs that low down the political food chain, his party is similarly Yankified and trying to inflict it on the rest of us. Last week, Novara Media reported on how Reform-led Essex County Council was banning libraries in the county from promoting Pride and Black History Month. The BBC also reported on it, and this is from their article. Chris Hossack, Reform Cabinet Member for Residents and Community Services, said he wanted Essex's 74 libraries to be neutral spaces for all. Librarians were informed they should no longer promote events on social media channels or by creating bespoke book displays for them during a verbal briefing. Hossack said true equality could only be achieved by removing promotion for all topics. There's a day or a month or whatever it might be for a whole range of things. Not everybody is encompassed in that, he said. When you put a month or a day on for one characteristic, then by default, you're excluding somebody else. There's plenty of opportunity for campaigns and organisations that want to promote International Women's Day and Black history to do that. And what I'm saying is we're not going to do that in our libraries. There have been similar shenanigans in other parts of the country. Last year, Reform-controlled Durham County Council withdrew funding for this year's Pride Parade, with Deputy Leader Darren Grimes saying the event had, quote, morphed into a travelling billboard for gender ideology and political activism. There's a good news story, though, because the event went ahead anyway last weekend, thanks to contributions from unions, including the Durham Miners Association, with participants calling it bigger and better than ever. Now, that's the kind of solidarity I really like to see there, Ash, a solidarity against this kind of like culture war, Yankified nonsense, right? What do you make of these stories?
I mean, first, the whole thing is pantomime because Reform went big on being an anti-tax party. Every single Reform-controlled council has put up council tax by basically the full whack. And so they say, oh, we're going to recover costs by, defunding woke stuff and, not having any more translators and interpreters available for migrants. Fine, do all that stuff. You're still putting the council tax up by top whack because, there's hardly any money being spent on that. There is an awful lot of money being spent on adult and children's social care, right? That is the really, really big one for councils up and down the country. And there is nothing that Reform have proposed which is going to touch the sides of that funding crisis. But I think you're right that there is a sort of Yankification. And this is something about America starts turning me into Maggie Smith, right? I start becoming the dowager from Downton Abbey, and I'm like, America, provincials, how dare you?
What's in America?
I'm just like, ugh. But I feel actually quite defensive of like the ways in which England is culturally really different from the UK, dispositionally really different, and it can be things which are really minor. Like I think it's crazy that in America, grown adults will tell other grown adults, "Good job." Save that for dogs and children. I think that's an insane thing to say to grown-ups. And so anything from that really small thing to things which are much bigger, which is we've got a very live and let live cultural disposition as a country. And actually, there's been an awful lot of organic social change in terms of people's attitudes when it comes to all sorts of things. So that could be something like interracial relationships and marriages. It could be the acceptance of gay and lesbian relationships. All of those things have transformed an awful lot in my lifetime. And I think that we've got to see these highly vaunted Reform, rollbacks on things like, a pride display on a library. I was just impressed that you lot could read. So, well done on making it into a library in the first place, Reform councillors. But all of this stuff is about, I think, rolling back on the cultural, organic successes of the way in which Britain has become a much more tolerant and inclusive country.
I think there's also maybe the idea that, if you sort of roll back towards kind of like, I don't know, Christian exclusivity in some way about what forms life can take, then you encourage maybe they hope there'll be an uptake in Christianity and a return to like Christian nationalism. Maybe that's,
This is my favourite thing about Restore. So there's a gentleman called Charlie Downs who's very involved with Restore and he's always on Twitter. And one of the things that he talked about is that, what it really means to be British is to be Christian. And I was like, fine, but it's a really incoherent position to be like anti-immigration, pro-Christian, because your faith is being kept alive by immigration. And that's why London and Birmingham are actually outliers from the rest of the country. The rest of the country is becoming less religious as time goes on. That's being driven by white people.
Yeah. The Church of England is largely African. Like that is just a fact, right? That's where the largest parts of the Anglican, Anglican community in the world are. Is there's huge populations of Anglicans.
And I think this is also one of the things which is really challenging for nationalists is that one of the principles of the big Abrahamic religions is that your faith and your religion and the structure that you're in and the community that you're in is much bigger than a national boundary. Right, it's huge. You're in a fellowship of man, and it's something which transcends the nation state. So that's actually another one of those incoherences, which as a I would say not the most observant Muslim in the entire world. I find it amusing.
On the idea of pantomime, something I found really funny is that in the Durham County Council case of the Council of Pride, I think the total amount that the council was giving to that was £2,500, which they then were like, no, we've now got to give it to like social care. It's really, that's needed. I mean, that is a drop in the bucket, right? That's not touching any sides. But then they raised 25,000, the union. So, that made for a better price. I mean, I'd love the council to be chipping in, but actually, if people want what they want, they're going to get it. Right?
I mean, look, I actually think that a really good use of council money is anything which encourages people using outdoor space well. And so I think Pride can be a part of that, but I also think like big screens for the World Cup, sporting facilities, all of this stuff is a really good use of council money. And I think that one of the things which has been missing from the left, and I don't see anyone really talking about this, and for all of, Burnham's much vaunted, I'm doing politics in a different way from, everyone who's come before. All he can really talk about is buses. But having a vision of the good life and a good use of public space and social space, that's not something that's in there. And I think that there is something that the Green Party could do about it, and they could speak to the different parts of their coalition. They could talk about access to outdoor space ranging from city parks all the way to, the needs of conservation and access to nature in the British countryside. That's something that they could do. But it's a weirdly missing thing from UK politics. And I think that that's where the sort of knee-jerk nastiness of reform, you look at reform and you go, what do you like?
Yeah.
It's a party whose politics is shaped around one imaginary old man who's yelling at a cloud.
And what they also apparently don't like is stimulating the local economy, right? Because these things bring a lot of, people spend money when they're at a pride celebration or, at some kind of, commemoration for or whatever kind of celebration
You know how much
it
I
is.
drank at Durham Miners Gala from 10 a.m.?
I'm not even going to ask. Hasan Piker is one of the world's most popular streamers. But last week, Piker, alongside his uncle, the Young Turks founder, Cenk Uygur, was barred from visiting the UK by Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood. We had Cenk on the show last Monday, where he explained why he thought the UK government had decided to take such a draconian approach. Now, Hasan Piker has appeared on LBC, where Lewis Goodall grilled him over some of the past comments he'd made that were apparently used to justify the ban by Shabana Mahmood, with the Home Office labelling him as, quote, a person not considered conducive to the public good. Here's one part of that interview.
But do you think it might ever be better sometimes just to never compare any Jews to Nazis? It might just be wise to do that.
No, I don't. I'm not so precious about that comparison. And I've actually had
But maybe that's
long and
easy
very
for you to
thoughtful
say as a
debates.
non-Jewish person.
Oh, for sure. But I'm,
I mean, you can call them lots of things, Hasan. I'm just sort of trying to be as sort of generous as possible.
Well-
but you could. There are so many things you could call those settlers. I'm not defending those settlers for a moment. I think a lot of them are committing heinous acts. I think a lot of the people in the far right of the Netanyahu government are absolutely appalling. I would say that completely explicitly. But you know what? You could probably say all that, and you could probably make a stronger case and not undermine yourself by comparing them to Nazis, because Nazis literally tried to exterminate who they are as Jews.
Yes, I don't disagree with that. The comparison,
why'd you do it?
in my opinion, the comparison, in my opinion, is not only graphic, but it's apt. Because Nazism is a fascist ideology. It's a dangerous
Well,
fascist
call them
ideology
fascists
that
then.
led to-
Call them fascists. You don't need to
that
call them
led to-
Nazis or
well, I do that
neo-Nazis.
as well. But the reason why I specifically deploy the term Nazi, is because, well, two reasons. Number one, the goals of ethnic cleansing are identical, and especially considering that a genocide has unfolded at this point, a modern day genocide with different tools. It's not the same exact type of genocide as the Holocaust, of course, not the concentration camps, and yet it's an open air prison that has been bombarded with almost 10 atom bombs worth of explosive ordnance that my government, and as a matter of fact, your government has aided and abetted in the process of. And from that perspective, the reason why I say I'm not so precious about this, while always maintaining the position that anti-Semitism is completely unacceptable, I always say I'm not precious about this because at the end of the day, it's a genocide. At the end of the day, this is an apartheid state, and Zionism as an ideology is a racist ideology. And many Jewish thinkers are now also coming to terms with that, even if they had self-identified as Zionists their entire lives.
That conversation went on a little bit longer.
So you would compare what's
place for a
happened in
lot of-
Gaza to the Holocaust?
It's not to the same extent, no, but I have compared it to the Holocaust, yes. It's no different than saying these concentration camps that we have in the United States of America are turning into death camps. Fascism is not a static concept. It's an ideology. It's a very dangerous one that I oppose unconditionally across the board.
But it's not the
entire
Holocaust,
purpose-
is it, Hassan? It's not the Holocaust.
No, of
And to
course.
compare
No,
it to...
it's-
I think the thing about you is you speak compellingly about many things, but you undermine your case and you open yourself to the accusation, which might not be unreasonable, of anti-Semitism by making these comparisons between what the Israeli government is doing, and let's be honest, Jews and Nazis and things they did in the Holocaust, because however heinous we might find what has happened in Gaza, and many of my listeners and viewers would, it is still not the same as the mass extermination and the ritualistic extermination of people which happened on a daily basis during the Holocaust. So why compare the two things?
Because I don't want it to get to the Holocaust. And this is the best part of this conversation, and I love having this conversation, because Holocaust studies are profoundly important. but they're not profoundly important so that we can understand what took place and then assume that it's never going to happen again. The entire point of genocide scholarship and specifically scholarship surrounding the Holocaust is so that we understand exactly how a society can move in that direction, and how so many otherwise kind people, I assume, can turn a blind eye to the atrocities that are unfolding, so that we understand what took place and never allow it to happen again.
Ash, I wanted to ask you about that exchange between Goodall and Piker. I really liked what Piker had to say about like the importance of like genocide and Holocaust studies, and what they're actually for, which is not just to commemorate but to learn. But what did you make of that argument?
So this thing about it being always anti-Semitic to draw any kind of comparison between the state of Israel and Nazi Germany, it's one of the examples given in the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Now, when the Labour Party was debating whether or not to adopt it, myself, Michael Walker, a few people on the left were arguing vociferously against it. And of course, that's something that the Labour Party eventually caved on. And one of the things that was shaping my thinking at the time is that, one, you have Jewish genocide scholars who are drawing the comparison themselves. And the reason why they're doing it is because they think it's an apt thing to do, to draw a comparison between the defining experience for Jewish people in the last 200 years and what's happening now. So yes, there are material similarities in terms of the use of starvation, the use of various systems of apartheid, the creation of an open-air prison, ghettoization. There are material comparisons to make, but there is also a sense of we're appealing to something in our history as Jewish people. And I think it is frankly absurd and insulting to say, well, that's anti-Semitic. The second thing is that it's part of something which I wrote about in the book, which is this drive towards a politics that detaches us from a material reality. So when you go, well, by definition, that's anti-Semitic, and it doesn't actually matter what's happening on the ground, what you're doing is you're saying words and semantics and the games that we play with words and semantics should have more political influence than what is happening. Yeah. Right? You're going, well, what's the definition of rain, rather than sticking your head out the window to see whether or not it's happening. And I think that kind of semantic weaponization, it's not something which is unique to the way in which anti-Semitism has been mobilized and weaponized in order to shut down criticism of Israel. I think it's something which is a power relation, which you can see more generally, but I think it's something which has been utilized to really good effect with anti-Semitism itself. And I think that this is what Lewis Goodall was saying, is that he wasn't saying, well, it's untrue and therefore I object to it, which is a debate that two people can have. You can debate what is the truth. He was making a debate on the basis of definitions. And the thing is that language is, infinitely malleable and flexible. You can define things in any way you want. There is a limit to which you can keep insisting it bears a reality to the actual world that we live in.
Yeah, I think it's like, there's a kind of argument that Hasan makes, which I think is a good one. He doesn't really make it explicitly like this is the way I would make it, which is that, either you believe that something genocidal has occurred in Gaza or you don't. If you believe it, there's nothing that you won't say to draw attention to it and to hold people accountable for this massive, massive crime. If you don't believe it has, then you're going to have a lot of problems with the words that people use to draw attention to it, because you fundamentally don't agree that the reality is the way.
I think there's a middle space.
Yeah.
I think, and the middle space is what you've been taught and the way you've been taught to think about genocide as a commemorative exercise, which is very, very narrow and is predominantly centered around not all the victims of the Holocaust, but certain victims of the Holocaust, is that when reality comes into conflict with that, and it's a culture of commemorization, which has been, again, weaponized and utilized to good effect by Israel. I'm not saying that's an argument against being taught about the Holocaust, but it's the way in which the centrality of the Holocaust is used by Israel as a justification for its existence. It's basically, we get to do some ethnic cleansing as a treat.
Yeah.
Right. And it's a really uncomfortable place when you're confronted with that. So everyone's very comfortable. And by everyone, what I mean is this is the sort of mainstream media take and point of view. Everyone's fine if you say never again to mean never again for Jewish people. But if you say, well, never again is never again for everyone, and that means that nobody is uniquely protected when it comes to the obligations we all have for the prevention of an ongoing genocide, they don't like that very much.
Yeah, what you say though is so true as well about that commemorative kind of approach. You know, like a genocide is only something that ever happens in black and white. Like that's the vibe, isn't it? Yeah. Ash, I want to play you another clip from that interview, one where Goodall appears to be saved by a producer whispering a fact into his earpiece. Thank God for producers.
Look, I get everything you're saying, Hasan, but you know, when you say that Hamas is 1,000 times better than Israel, I mean, let's leave aside the facts that Israel, whatever we think about it, is a democratic state, admittedly one that's been going down a more authoritarian direction. You say you'd vote for...
It's democratically in favor of genocide and apartheid. So
it's also got Arab Israelis and Palestinian Israelis who live there as citizens with others, so which is not the same as apartheid in South Africa.
They're considered second-class citizens as dictated by the Israeli constitution.
But the point is...
There are varying degrees of discrimination in Israeli society.
But I tell you where there's a lot of discrimination in Hamas-run Gaza. I mean, how would you feel about being a gay man, for example, living under Hamas, or a woman, for example, and you say you would vote for them 1,000 times over? You can't vote for them.
I know gay Palestinians, and they would say the exact same thing that I'm about to tell you. The biggest threat to their existence is the Israeli occupation. They might have disagreements with Hamas. They might not
they'll be pushed off a bridge.
Elements. No, that's racialized.
It's not racialized. It literally happens. The LGBTQ group, Hasan, LGBT groups around the world have condemned her.
That's not true. That's simply not true.
So you think that is? It is literally.
I will have to push back on this. What you're saying is actually not true, and also a little bit messed up to say, because these groups are very different from one another. I am not an Islamist personally, obviously. I am not. I'm not someone who's ever going to be in favor of religious fundamentalism. But Hamas does not represent religious fundamentalist governance. It represents.
You can get up to 10 years in prison for being gay. You can get up to 10 years in prison for being gay down the barrel of a Hamas gun. That wouldn't happen to you in Tel Aviv. Whatever we think about Israel, that wouldn't happen to you in Tel Aviv.
It doesn't matter, because the gay people are being killed by Israeli bombs.
An important correction there from the producer to Goodall, that actually it's ISIS that was chucking people off bridges and whatever. And yeah, there are prison sentences for being gay under Hamas. Not great, but it's not the same story that gets being put out all the time.
No, so it's become kind of a meme online of like, well, try saying that in Gaza, you'd be thrown off a building as a gay person. It's something which is said to Owen Jones an awful lot. And it is basically a deliberate attempt to say that Hamas and ISIS are the same thing. And that has been an explicit talking point of the Israeli state. Now, does that mean that you would look at Hamas's legislation around gay relationships and go, well, that's fine? No, but there is a difference. And in fact, when you look at countries that we consider allies, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and you look at some of their punishments for gay relationships, well, come on, what are we talking about here? There is I don't know how to put this without sounding wildly offensive, but there is this sort of...
Can't be wildly offensive.
Liberal idiocy.
Oh, that's mild.
That was so much more mild than the thing that I actually wanted to say. But there is a kind of liberal idiocy where you take things which are the product of debates that we have about how do we want to conduct ourselves and live in a society which is relatively rich, relatively democratic, and doesn't have to worry about bombs falling on your head, immediate starvation, famine, imperialism, etc. All right? And that, I think, is a set of concerns and priorities that come from the immediacies of survival. I'm, of course, not talking about deprivation, poverty, the way disabled people are treated, but the immediacies of survival are not a day-to-day concern for most people in this country. And so you can actually go, what's it mean to live here? What's it mean for everyone to flourish? If you have bombs raining down on your head, you have no food, no medicine, no water, you have communications being cut off, every other day. If you have an army which is invaded and is snatching up young men, including children, and taking them to torture camps and rape camps, I think that that's probably a bigger problem for a gay Palestinian than what is my status under the law with Hamas. And that's the thing, is that it's a common sense position, which is there is a hierarchy of needs, right? You know, your first need as a human being is survival. And that's precisely what's being endangered by the IDF. And so I think that that's, you know, when Lewis Goodall is sort of rolling his eyes, he's like, oh, well, it would matter to a gay Palestinian, is that that's not actually something which is being said by gay people in the Gaza Strip. They're saying, we need food, we need the bombs to stop, we need rebuilding, we need an end to the siege, because I might die tomorrow. Like, I might die tomorrow. And so what my legal status is, I'm not saying it's not a problem, but that's not tomorrow's problem.
It's not at the front of my mind
No.
right now. Yeah. I also think what really annoys me as well about these kind of claims about, you know, I don't know, the level of how of you know, gay rights and whatever, you know, being set by the West. You know, it's not that long ago that we were jailing gay people, that we were chemically castrating gay people, and it's in my lifetime that thousands of gay men were left to die untreated for a novel disease that no one was interested in researching. You know, that all happened here. We've only recently come to a point where, you know, we're sort of all embracing, at least, you know, on the surface. You know, obviously we've got people like Reform who are not that embracing, perhaps. Everything can change, right? Everything can change if the circumstances change. Like, I think people who have hard-won rights really recognize the fact that those rights can go if the circumstances change and as needs change.
And the thing is that Hamas is a direct consequence of Israeli expansion. Right? You don't have Israeli expansion, you don't have the ongoing occupation, you don't have the sort of ritualized humiliation of the PLO, you don't have deliberate attempts to ferment an Islamist alternative to a secular PLO, you don't have Hamas. And so thinking of Hamas as a product merely of Islamism, and of course the political history and ideological development of Islamism is really important to Hamas, I'm not dismissing that for 1 second, but without thinking about the way in which Hamas was considered a bit of a necessary evil by Israel, because that's really important for preventing the formation of a viable Palestinian state.
Absolutely.
You then have to look at, you know, Hamas's line on gay people within that context, but again, you can't do that within British media, because what they think being balanced and informative is I go, 50% these guys are bad, 50% these guys are bad, right? So I go, well, 50% these guys are bad because they're sniping children, they're raping detainees, they're bombing schools, hospitals and places of refuge, and they're imposing starvation. But these guys are also bad because they don't like gay people. 50-50.
Yeah.
50-50.
Scales just matching, yeah. Ash, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. And remember, that cocaine and puppies budget, out of control.
We're burning through it. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.